extraordinarily, for the 7th day running, Gary Lineker is leading the headlines. Gary Lineker, the freedom of speech champion, the moral compass of the nation, the warrior for the underdog, the freedom fighter. Oh, give me a break. A millionaire former footballer and Chris salesman and TV pundit who just happens to spout the latest acceptable opinions of his well-to-do millionaire celebrity party circuit chums. Writing a tweet comparing the government's new migrant boat policy to the language of the Nazis. How stunning and brave you are, Gary. And yes, I know he didn't say the N-word, but he referred to 1930s Germany. He wasn't talking about the Lib Dems, was he? A stupid, ill-informed tweet, offensive to many people, has been turned into a full-blown national crisis. But this isn't about the government's migrant policy. It's not even really about Gary Lineker or a Tory government apparently demanding the BBC toes the line or faces losing the licence fee. This is about a once treasured, once revered national institution, the BBC, maintaining its place as a politically neutral organisation representing not just some, but every single one of those TV licence fee payers. And not just those who happen to agree with the latest approved opinions of the metropolitan elite. Imagine, if you will, Gary Lineker had tweeted his backing for the government's channel migrant policy. Would those currently leaping to his defence, would they be proclaiming the importance of freedom of speech then? Or would they be the very same people calling for Gary Lineker to be sacked? I think we all know the answer to that. When people say they want freedom of speech, they only seem to want it for the people they agree with. I'm very happy for Gary Lineker to give his views, stupid or not. I'm very happy for him to have freedom of speech. I want everyone to. But this is about a contractual obligation to the BBC, and the BBC's contractual obligation to you and me, the licence fee payer. It's a tax. We're forced to pay it if we want to watch live telly. We have a right to have a say. The BBC today needs to decide whether they back down or not with Gary Lineker is almost beside the point. They need to decide, what are your guidelines on neutrality in social media? What are those guidelines and who do they apply to? Is it just news journalists? Is it everyone on the BBC? When do they apply? Is it just social media? Is it in other occasions? And then, once they know what those rules are, they need to apply them across the board to everyone, every time, each time it happens. And then we at least will all know where we stand. So let's talk about all of that right now with Rebecca Ryan, who's the campaign director at Defund the BBC. Good morning to you, Rebecca.
Morning, Julia.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt at all this has been an absolute gift to you, because the key issue here for me is I couldn't give two hoots what Gary Lineker thinks about anything. I tend not to take my political opinions from you know, former footballers. I'm old-fashioned like that. But the issue here is not, I think, a freedom of speech issue, and we discussed this with the Free Speech Union a bit earlier on the show. This is about the required need to be impartial for a taxpayer-funded national institution. And that's the key thing, isn't it? The way the BBC is funded and its role in British life, historically and in the present and possibly in the future, depends on it appearing to maintain some semblance of impartiality on political issues, and it just doesn't anymore.
Exactly, and that's what's been highlighted here by Gary. And as you say, it's been very helpful to us. Gary Lineker, every time he tweets something that is, you know, left wing, which is pretty much every time he tweets, you know, people get very upset and flock to defund the BBC to find out how they can stop paying for this. And what it comes down to is that the charter that is put in place, which allows the BBC to essentially tax British people if they want to watch any live broadcast TV. Obliges the BBC to be impartial and to also be representative of the all areas of the UK and unifying. Now, as the BBC's top paid star, Gary Lineker is benefiting to the tune of £1.35 million from those taxpayers as a result of that obligation. And obviously you can see there's a clear breach there. So as you said, this isn't an issue at all about free speech. I'm very much pro-free speech, as are the vast majority of people who support defund the BBC. The point here is that they're in breach of their contract with the British people.
Yeah, and that's it. Those are two completely different things. And I also think it's incredible how many people, and I made the point a bit earlier on the show, who are defending his right to free speech right now, would not be defending his right to free speech if he'd tweeted, I think this channel migrant policy, this new law is the right thing, and we need to cut down on the number of people arriving illegally on our shores, and this is the only way to do it. I think those very same people, the Alistair Campbells and all the, bien passants of North London and the millionaire set, I think they would be outraged and they would be insisting he was sacked and silenced and obeying the BBC impartiality rules, because when they talk about freedom of speech, those people only think that means freedom of speech for speech they agree with. I've not got an issue with Gary Lineker having that opinion. Gary Lineker is entitled to as many stupid, ill-informed, historically nonsensical views as he wants. I don't care. And he can spout those views if he works for Talk, if he works for ITV or Channel 4 or Sky or anybody else. What he can't do, in my view, is, as I understand those impartiality rules, is give those views when he is a face that is known now. He previously was England captain. He is now mostly known for the fact that he presents a flagship sports show on the BBC, and I have to help pay his wages.
Exactly. I mean, the thing is, when it comes down to he receives 1.35 million from British taxpayers, and that the right to tax people is for people who watch live broadcast TV, and he's in receipt of that money.
And it is. Can we clarify? It is a tax. Now, I don't necessarily think that we shouldn't have some state funding of the state broadcaster. I would just differ in terms of how the state broadcaster was allowed to broadcast. But it is a tax. People say, well, it's a licence fee. You know, a lot of people say, well, I don't pay it. I mean, if you watch live television, you are legally obliged to pay it. And if you don't pay it, you can be fined, taken to court. If you refuse to pay the fine, you can be imprisoned. People have been imprisoned for not paying the licence fee. That's a tax.
It is absolutely a tax, and it is categorised as a tax under the OBR. So it is a tax. It's like a car tax or whatever, in that you're taxed for a certain thing. It's not a tax for everybody. So you can opt out of it, but to opt out of it is not a clear disconnect between the BBC and your payment. This is for watching all live broadcast TV. So if you watch Talk TV as it's broadcast live, then you have to pay the BBC. And that's why it's a tax. It's not connected directly to the BBC. And, this is why you need this charter and have these obligations in place. And this is what they have to adhere to. And then this whole free speech argument is completely, it's completely false. And it's disingenuous. And the whole point is, and what we hope is raised from this is this obligation, and that more people are made aware of it, because the BBC needs to now look at itself and say, what is it that we actually are going to do going forward?
And there's a lot there to us, in terms of political views. I mean, again, I can't bear the BBC non-stop green propaganda. I mean, and climate change propaganda. That, to me, is quite clearly a political issue. It's not necessarily so party political, with the main parties all in agreement with an insane net zero policy. And then you've got, the sort of support of things like taking the knee and the rainbow armbands in Qatar. And I have to say, it was absolutely fascinating to watch Gary Lineker going off to Qatar, taking his money to present. I mean, he's talking about the need for freedom of speech and protecting people who are vulnerable and all of that. I mean, I don't know if his knowledge of the Nazis extends to the fact that they killed gay people as well. The same policy, imprisonment and execution of gay people in Qatar. But he was quite happy to go and take their money. And we didn't hear him speaking out on a lot of that when there was money to be made. And that's the thing, isn't it? When we talk about freedom of speech in these circumstances, it is only freedom for one side. The acceptable viewpoint in that sort of metropolitan elite, multi-millionaire circuit of sort of approved viewpoints on things like Brexit, on things like immigration or anything else. But if someone at the BBC had different views on that, they wouldn't still be at the BBC. Their career would have been ended already.
Exactly, absolutely. And this is the thing, when you need to lift the bonnet on the BBC and say, look, this is actually what is in place. This is because a lot of people are confused about what you can and can't watch without having to pay the TV license. And the BBC are very happy with that being kind of a bit unknown, a bit mysterious, because it means more people will err on the side of caution and will keep paying. And let's lift the lid on it and say, look, this is what they're obliged to do. This is what you have to, you have to pay them for this reason, and this is what you don't have to pay them for. Because if you're watching on demand and catch up, as long as you don't need to, You don't need to at all. I mean, most people don't know that.
So what would be a reasonable solution? Well, that's the phrase that Tim Davie, the BBC's Director General, used, saying he's working with Gary Lineker. Let's listen to his exact words, spoken in an exclusive interview with the BBC yesterday.
I'm in listening mode. I want to make sure that going forward we have a workable solution. Let's be clear, we've got the best sports broadcaster in the world. We want to make sure that he can come back on air. We work together to make that happen, and everyone wants to see a reasonable solution to this, and that's where I am. I am really focused on getting to a solution, working quickly together to make it happen.
There's a lot of management speak there, listening mode, reasonable solution. A lot of people might suggest, Rebecca, that the reasonable solution is that everybody, other than, you know, the political editor and your news reporters in that very neutral, supposedly neutral mode of the BBC, that they are allowed to give whatever their views are and we get to know what their views are. Wouldn't it be better if we did actually know categorically that, you know, the BBC largely, I know people can point to Andrew Neil and can point to Lord Sugar, but otherwise they pretty much employ people almost entirely on the left.
Exactly. I mean, the solution here is for the BBC, well, the best solution for us would be to get rid of the licence fee altogether, because, you know, as it currently stands, you're locked into funding the BBC as long as, you know, if you want to watch any live broadcast TV, and we think that's ultimately unfair. People are being bullied on their doorsteps, they're being forced to pay for something they're really reluctant to do. But if that's not possible, the next reasonable solution is for the BBC to actually deliver on its obligations, which is to be impartial. And they can say, oh, well, we're not news presenters or whatever. You're taking £1.35 million from British taxpayers who, you know, that you have this obligation to, then absolutely you must be impartial.
Yeah. Or you could just move to ITV. Probably they'd be slangling £3 million cheques at him, and you can get paid more, and you can speak out about government migration policy to your heart's content. Rebecca Ryan, campaign director at Defund the BBC. Thank you very much for joining us.